Assalamu alaikum aspirants. Welcome to our next lecture of international law, which is relation between international law and state law. First of all, we will be discussing the outline of our today's topic, which is relation between international law and state law. First of all, we will be discussing the definition of international law and state law, then the relationship between international law and state law, explained in view of different books along with examples. After that, we will be concluding our topic. So coming over to our first heading, definition of international law and state law. International law is a set of rules and principles that govern the relations between states and other entities that are recognized as legal subjects under international law. It provides a framework for the peaceful resolution of disputes and the protection of rights and interests of state and other entities. It encompasses a wide range of subjects, including the laws of war, human rights, the law of sea, and international trade. Now, the state law. State law, on the other hand, refers to the domestic legal system of a particular state. It includes the constitution, statutes, and case law of the state, as well as the institution and processes for enforcing the law within the state territory. State law governs the relations between individuals and organizations within the state and provides the framework for the protection of individual rights and resolution of disputes within the state. Now coming over to the relationship between international law and state law. The relationship between international law and state law is complex and can vary depending on the specific context. In some cases, international law is considered to be superior to state law and can override conflicting domestic law. For example, the principles of international human rights law, such as prohibition of torture, are considered to be res cogens, which means that they are considered to be binding on all states and cannot be overridden by domestic laws. On the other hand, in other cases, state law is considered to be supreme and international law is considered to be subsidiary to it. For example, the domestic law of a state governs the process of ratifying and implementing international treaties within the state's territory. In most cases, international law and state law interact and complement each other. For example, international trade agreements provide a framework for the regulation of trade between states, but also rely on the domestic laws of state to enforce the rules and resolve disputes. Similarly, international human rights law provide a framework for the protection of individuals' rights, but it is implemented and enforced through domestic laws and institutions. Now, the next is explain international law and state law, also the relationship between them in the following books. First of all, the international law, according to Malcolm Shaw, defines international law as the body of legal rules which apply between sovereign states and such other entities as have been granted international personality. It is a set of rules and principles that govern the relations between states and other entities. They are recognized as legal subjects under international law. Example of how international law governs the relations between states. Shaw uses the example of how the United Nations Charter sets out the principles and rules that govern the relations between states, including the prohibition on the use of force in international relations. Example of how international law provides a framework for the peaceful resolution of dispute. Shaw gives the example of how the International Court of Justice provides a forum for the peaceful resolution of disputes between states through binding decisions and advisory opinions. Now, the second is from Principle of Public International Law, and broadly defines international law as a body of rules and principles that are binding on states in their relations with each other. Example of how international law is binding on states. Brownlee used the example of how the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties sets out rules and principles that are binding on states in their relations with each other in regards to the conclusion, application, and termination of treaties. Example of how international law is developed and applied by international community. Brownlee used the example of how the International Law Commission is responsible for the codification of progressive development of the international law and how its work is used by states, international organizations, and courts to interpret and apply international law. Now, the next is International Law and Human Rights by S.K. Kapoor. Dr. S.K. Kapoor defines international law as a body of legal rules that regulates the relation between states as well as the relations between states and other international actors. Example of how international law regulates the relation between states. Kapoor uses the example of how the United Nations Charter sets out rules and principles that regulate the relation between states, including the prohibition of the use of force in international relations and the principle of the peaceful settlement of disputes. Example of how international law is developed and applied by a variety of actors. Kapoor gives the example of how the International Criminal Court is responsible for the prosecution of individuals for war crimes, crime against humanity, and genocide, and how it is used by the international community to hold the individual accountable for the crimes. Now, the fourth is Introduction to International Law by J.G. Stark. J.G. Stark defines international law as a system of rules and principles that govern the relation between states as well as the relation between states and other actors. Example of how international law governs the relation between states. Stark uses the example of how the United Nations Charter set out rules and principles that govern the relation between states, including the prohibition of the use of force in the international relation and the principle of the peaceful settlement of dispute. Example of how international law provides a framework for the protection of human rights and interests states and other actors. Stark gives the example of how the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights sets out the basic human rights that states are obligated to respect, protect, and fulfill. Now, coming over to the relation between international law and state law. All the books explain the complex relation between international law and state law and how they interact and complement each other in different ways. In some cases, international law is considered to be superior to state law and can override conflicting domestic laws. On the other hand, in other cases, state law is considered to be supreme and international law is considered to be subsidiary to it. In most cases, international law and state law interact and complement each other. International law provides a framework for the relations between states and other actors, while state law governs the relation within a state. With this, I come over to the conclusion part. In conclusion, international law and state law are two distinct legal systems that interact and complement each other in different ways. While international law provides a framework for the relation between state and other entities, state law governs the relation within a state. The relation between these two legal systems can vary depending on the specific context, but generally they interact and complement each other to ensure the protection of rights and interests of states, individuals, and other entities. With this, I come over to the end of my today's topic. So, subscribe and stay updated. I thank you all.